But before we dive into the disturbing tales of the night, let me ask you, do you have the courage to stay until the end? Most viewers don't subscribe to the channel, perhaps out of oversight, or perhaps because after hearing these stories, they never slept the same way again. If you think you can handle it, click subscribe now. I'm a taxi driver in Cleveland, Ohio, and I've seen it all. Drunk people, arguing couples, lost tourists. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to what happened that early morning. It was late autumn, one of those cold nights where the fog covers the streets and makes everything seem kind of unreal. My shift was already ending, but before going home, I decided to pick up one more fare. That's when I received a call from a passenger downtown, near a bar that had been closed for a long time. When I arrived, I didn't see anyone, just the empty street, the fog dancing under the flickering streetlights. But then, the car door opened on its own. In the back seat, a man sat down. He was wearing an elegant black suit, but it looked old, as if he had stepped out of a photograph from the 1920s. His face was pale, and he wore a hat that covered part of his face. "Where to, sir?" I asked, looking at him through the rearview mirror. He slowly raised his face. His eyes were deep, dark, without any glimmer. "Home," he replied, his voice an icy whisper. I swallowed hard. Something about him made me uneasy, but I did what I always do. I stepped on the gas and followed the GPS. The ride was silent, and the air inside the car seemed to grow heavier and heavier. You know when you feel like something is wrong, but you can't quite figure out what. That's when I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. The man wasn't breathing. It wasn't a trick of the light. His chest wasn't rising or falling. He was completely still, except for his eyes, which were now fixed on me. A chill ran down my spine. When we arrived at the destination, an old house on the outskirts of the city, I turned to talk to him, but he wasn't there anymore. The back seat was empty. The door never opened. No sound, no movement. My heart raced. I turned to look at the house and felt my blood run cold. The residence was completely abandoned, windows broken, roof collapsing. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. But then, a curtain moved in one of the upstairs windows. I stepped hard on the gas and got out of there as fast as I could. The next day, still trying to understand what had happened, I researched the address. I discovered that in the 1920s, a man named Harold Bishop was murdered there, stabbed by a group of criminals. He was a gambler who won a fortune at the game, but never made it home that night. They say his spirit still tries to go home. And that early morning, I was the one who took him there. But what really scares me is something else. Since that night, every time I look in the rearview mirror of my taxi, I have the strange feeling that someone is still sitting there watching me. I'm Jose Luis, a taxi driver in Veracruz, Mexico, for over 10 years. I've heard and seen strange things, but nothing compares to what happened that rainy night. It was around 8 at night when I went out for another work shift. The weather was bad. A fine, constant rain that left the streets wet and dark. I was driving along the avenues near the port, an old place full of stories that the older people love to tell. I stopped at a traffic light, waiting for the green light to release me, when suddenly someone knocked on the passenger window. I almost jumped in my seat. It was a woman of about 60 years old, dressed in black, completely soaked by the rain. But what really bothered me was her look, empty, fixed, as if she was there, but at the same time, far away. She opened the taxi door without waiting for permission and sat behind me. "Take me home," she said in a weak voice, handing me a piece of paper with an address written by hand. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't seen her on the sidewalk before. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. "Don't be silly, Jose," I thought to myself. I put the car in gear and followed the direction to the address. In the rearview mirror, I saw that she was watching me without blinking, her eyes red, as if she had been crying. "Are you okay, Mom?" I asked, trying to be polite. She took a few seconds to respond. "I need to get home soon. My husband and son are waiting for me." There was something strange in her voice. It sounded old, as if it came from another time. I sped up a little to get there faster, but upon arriving at the destination, my heart almost stopped. The address led me to a deserted street near the old cemetery of Veracruz. There was only a decrepit and abandoned house with broken doors and windows. I checked the paper again, thinking I had made a mistake. "Ma'am, I think I'm mistaken." But when I looked back, the seat was empty. The woman had disappeared. The car was locked. The door had never opened, but she was simply no longer there. Fear froze me in the seat. It couldn't be real. I decided to wait a bit, see if she reappeared. But the silence was absolute. The only thing that moved was the rain hitting the windshield. I tried to calm my mind. Maybe she got out quickly and I didn't notice, I thought. But then a low sound echoed inside the car. It was a whisper coming from the back seat. "They are waiting for me!" My blood ran cold. I started the car and sped away without looking back. I just wanted to get out of that street as quickly as possible. When I got home, still trembling, I typed the address on the internet, and that's when my breathing stopped. The news was from exactly 1 year ago. A 60-year-old woman had died in a car accident on the same street to which I took her. Her husband and son had died 10 years before, when their house caught fire due to a gas leak. And in the photo of the article, it was her. Panic took over me. She was still trying to go home, and I took her there. That night, the smell of wilted roses took over my taxi, a smell that did not disappear, no matter how many times I opened the windows. 3 days later, when I passed again through the same traffic light where I found her, I smelled the smell again. And I knew at that moment that she was still around, waiting for another ride. My name is Jorge, and I've been a taxi driver for over 20 years in Aguascalientes, Mexico. In all this time, I've had many strange passengers. I've witnessed fights. I've seen people running from the police. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night. I was returning from the Aguascalientes International Airport after dropping off a passenger. I decided to wait a little while at the taxi stand outside in case any customers showed up needing a ride. It wasn't long before a well-dressed man approached the car. He seemed to be an executive, impeccable suit, leather briefcase in hand, and a tired look. "Good evening, sir. Where are we going?" I asked. "To the Hotel Real Plaza, please," he replied, as he put his suitcase in the trunk and got into the car. What I didn't expect was that he wasn't alone. A tall and very pale woman, wearing an elegant black dress, sat in the back seat, even before I could see where she had come from. I didn't question it. I thought she was his wife, colleague, or something like that. "How long until we get to the hotel?" the man asked, as he typed on his cell phone. "About 15 minutes tops," I replied, trying to be friendly. "Don't worry. You and your wife will have plenty of time to rest before dinner." The silence inside the taxi became heavy. After a few seconds, the man looked at me, confused. "My wife?" "Yes," I replied, laughing a little. "The lady who got in the taxi with you." He frowned and looked at the back seat. The woman was no longer there. I felt my heart stop. I saw that woman get in the car. She was there, sitting in the back seat, quiet and still. The man looked at me as if I were crazy. I came alone. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to understand what had happened. My instinct told me not to tell him anything. I was terrified, but I pretended that I had made a mistake. I drove as fast as possible to the hotel. The man paid, took his suitcase, and entered without realizing that someone else was following him. And then, what made me lose sleep for months happened. The next day, at 6 a.m., there was a loud knock on my door. It was an investigator from the public prosecutor's office. He showed me a picture of the man I took to the hotel the night before. "Do you recognize this person?" he asked. "Yes. He took my taxi from the airport last night," I replied, feeling a tightness in my chest. "What happened?" The officer sighed and stared at me with a heavy expression. "He was found dead in his hotel room this morning." My skin crawled all over. "But how?" I asked, already knowing that I didn't want to hear the answer. The body was lying on the bed, pale, as if he had died sleeping. There were no signs of violence. I swallowed hard. Then the investigator took a tablet out of his bag and opened a security recording from the hotel. "We found this a little strange. On the screen, I saw the footage from the hotel entrance. My taxi stopped, the man got out, took his suitcase and entered the building. And then, my blood ran cold. Behind him, a dark shadow appeared in the shape of a woman wearing the same elegant black dress. She glided on the sidewalk, following the man into the hotel. But when the hotel security guard came to greet him, the woman was no longer there. The recording cut off right after that. My mouth went dry. "Do you have any information about who might want to hurt him?" the officer asked. I shook my head, unable to answer. How could I explain that he had never been alone in the taxi? That there was something with him that night? That what was there wasn't human? People tried to theorize about what could have happened. Some said it was a vengeful spirit. Others that it was La Llorona. But the truth? I never drove to the airport after midnight again. And to this day, every time I look in the rearview mirror, my heart races, afraid of seeing that black dress again. My name is Carlos Contreras, and I've been a taxi driver in the state of Mexico for several years. I've gone through many strange things on the streets, aggressive drunks, passengers who tried to run away without paying, even some dangerous situations with robbers. But nothing prepared me for that night. It was almost midnight when I dropped off a passenger at her house and stopped at the corner to answer a call. I was still wondering if I should go home or try to pick up one more fare. That's when he appeared. From a dark, vacant lot, a well-dressed man came out carrying a large and worn suitcase. He didn't look like a homeless person. He wore a plain suit. He was clean, but his hands were trembling slightly. He approached my taxi. "Are you free?" he asked with a nervous smile. My first reaction was to hesitate. What the hell was a well-dressed man doing in a vacant lot at that hour? He noticed my hesitation and laughed. "Oh, sorry, I was just taking care of something there. I didn't ask anything else. After all, it was just a service." He threw the suitcase into the trunk and got into the car. I started driving, but something wasn't right. He was constantly looking around, restless. His legs were shaking, his fingers were drumming on his knee. To break the ice, I asked, "Traveling, sir?" He hesitated before answering. "Moving." His voice sounded strange. I decided not to ask anything else and just kept driving. That's when I heard the noise, a faint muffled sound, something like a kick or a soft knock coming from the trunk. My stomach churned. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man staring at me, his face pale. "Stop the car," his voice trembled. "Now!" But we were on a busy avenue. There was no way to stop in the middle of the road. It was then that the noise became louder. Bum, 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 the suitcase was shaking in the trunk. "What's in that suitcase?" I screamed, already feeling cold sweat on my forehead. The man opened the taxi door and jumped out while it was moving. I braked sharply, almost causing an accident. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man running desperately in the opposite direction, stumbling and almost being run over. The horns of the other cars sounded loudly, but I couldn't move. All I could do was look at the trunk, which was now quiet. For a few seconds, I thought about whether I should just go away. But what if there was a person inside? My hands were shaking as I got out of the taxi. With all the fear in the world, I opened the trunk. The suitcase was ajar, and inside it, a young woman with her body covered in bruises and dried blood. She was unconscious, but alive. my throat locked up. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I pressed the button on my cell phone and called the police. They arrived in a few minutes. The woman was rushed to the hospital, and I was called in for questioning. The investigation revealed that she was the man's ex-girlfriend. He had tried to kill her, but thought she was already dead and put her body in the suitcase to get rid of it. She survived. And a few days later, that man was arrested in Jalisco, trying to flee the country. The woman said that she saw him choosing me on the street, that he seemed nervous even before getting into the taxi. If I hadn't heard the sounds from the suitcase, she might never have been found alive. Since that night, I have never accepted passengers who come out of the middle of nowhere again. Because sometimes the real horror isn't the supernatural, it's people.